The summer of 1888 is when I tell this story. I am 54 years old, and my granddaughter Margaret is 3, and she has just asked me why our house is in a tree. I pick her up. I sit down in the cedar chair by the west window, the one her father asked me to build, before she was ever a thought in anyone's mind. And I hold her small weight against my chest, and I look up through the glass at the oak canopy spreading its September arms above us. And I say because a long time ago, 4 women came to a tree, and the tree said, "Stay." She thinks about this with the seriousness that 3-year-olds bring to questions they have decided matter. Then she asks whether the tree is also her grandmother. I laugh. Then I cry a little the way you cry when something is true enough to hurt. Then I say, "Yes, Margaret, the tree is your grandmother too." But that is the end. This is the beginning. September 1868. 3 men, one afternoon. 3 things I was told I could not do. The carpenter told me no woman builds a house around a living tree. The banker's man told me my dead husband's debt would take my land in 30 days. The richest man in Sweet Home, Oregon, told me to sell everything I owned for $40 and be grateful for the offer. I was 34 years old. I had 2 children, 12 acres of rock and slope, $87 in a tin box, and one thing none of those men could see when they looked at that land. I could see it, my daughter Clara could see it, though she was 5 and did not yet have words for what she was seeing. My son Eli, who was 7 and had spent 14 months learning to watch my hands instead of my face because my hands told the truth, my face was trained to withhold. He could see it too. What we could see was the oak, 300 years old, 6 feet across the trunk, maybe more. The crown spread 50 feet in every direction and turned the September light into something older than the land it fell on, something that had been filtering sun through leaves since before this territory had a name that men wrote on paper. 4 main lower branches grew out from the trunk at 12 feet, each one 14 inches thick, the diameter of a grown man's thigh, each one capable of holding a bear without flexing. The acorns it dropped were sweeter than any other oak in the valley. I would learn that later from a woman who had known this tree far longer than I had been alive. My husband Thomas had been dead 14 months. He had gone in 3 days. The pneumonia took him fast, which the doctor in Albany told me was a mercy, which I thought was a strange word for a man who had never watched someone he loved disappear faster than a candle in a draft. The fever broke him on a Tuesday. He was gone by Friday. I had spent the following 3 days barely remembering to feed the children, and then I had stood up because the children needed feeding, and I had not stopped standing since. The 12 acres had been Thomas's dream, not mine. Or rather, it had become mine the way all things become yours when the person who first wanted them is no longer there to want them. He had seen potential in the slope, in the proximity to the Calapooya tributary, in the thin soil that might, with enough work and enough luck, grow something worth growing. What he had not accounted for was the rock. What he had not accounted for was the slope's true angle, which was less agricultural promise and more geological argument against human habitation. The only flat ground on the entire 12 acres belonged to the oak. Cornelius Ward came first in the early part of that September afternoon on a horse that cost more than my remaining cash. He wore a coat of Portland wool that had never seen a full day's labor absorb into its fibers. His pocket watch chain caught the light in a way that felt deliberate, as though the chain itself had been instructed to gleam. He tipped his hat. He expressed condolences for Thomas with the practiced warmth of a man who delivers condolences the way other men deliver mail, regularly, efficiently, without particular feeling. Then he said $40 cash today for the 12 acres, which was more than any fair man would pay for rock and roots. He nodded toward the oak. He said he would even clear the stump for her. The word stump sat in the air between us. I did not move. Ward's smile widened by perhaps a quarter inch, which I had already learned was the tell of a man who mistakes silence for wavering. There was also, he mentioned the matter of a debt Thomas had carried. $28 owed to the feed store, a note Ward had purchased from the original creditor, which was now Ward's to call due. Mr. Whittle at the bank expected payment within 30 days. After 30 days auction, he touched the brim of his hat. He turned the horse. Before he was fully gone, without looking back, he said, "Two children on rocky ground, Mrs. Lindqvist. Think about them before you think about pride." I did not move until the sound of the hooves had dissolved into the distance. I became, in those minutes of stillness, very precisely aware of the oak behind me, its shadow crossing the ground, the particular quality of the air under its canopy, which was cooler than the air outside it by several degrees, which smelled of leaf meal and creek stone and something older that I did not have a name for yet. I put my palm flat against the bark. I had not touched anything in 14 months that gave back what I was putting in. Grief takes from every surface. It leaches warmth from wood weight, from bread color, from the sky. I had spent 14 months touching things that felt like touching the inside of my own absence. The bark of the oak was different. It was ridged and cool and alive in the specific, unhurried way of something that has been alive for 3 centuries and expects to be alive for 300 more. Under my palm, I felt something that was not grief. It was the first time since Thomas died that I had felt something that was not grief. It felt like a plan. It felt impossibly like my father's hands. Halvard Lindqvist had built boats in a Maine harbor for 40 years. He was dead now, 11 years dead of a heart that gave out quietly one morning, between one tide and the next, and I had not stood beside his workbench again since the week after his funeral. But standing with my palm against the oak that September's afternoon, I could feel him as clearly as I had ever felt him when he was living. He had carried me through his boatyard from the time I was 5 years old. By 8, I could name every joint on a hull. By 12, I could cut a mortise and tenon clean enough for him to nod once, which was the highest acknowledgement he gave to any work, human or wood. He had a way of speaking about joinery that other men reserve for scripture. Not with reverence exactly, but with the specificity of someone describing laws that existed whether you believed in them or not. A good joint does not fight the wood. He would say in the slow English he had built word by word over decades of working alongside men who spoke it as their first language. It shakes hands with the wood. Nails are a lazy man's shortcut. A true joint is a handshake that holds. Standing at that oak, I felt the handshake. I felt the plan forming the way plans form for people who learn to think in joints and load-bearing members. Not as a wish, not as a hope, but as a structure. Weight distributed, stress anticipated, wood working with wood instead of against it. Erasmus Cole arrived an hour later, riding back from a job in Brownsville, taking the road that passed my plot because it was shorter. He was a carpenter of genuine skill, which was evident in the way he looked at the oak. Not dismissively, but with a considered assessment of a man who has spent decades understanding what wood will do. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he laughed, but not with meanness. It was the laugh of someone who cannot help finding something funny, even when they know the other person won't agree. "Build around that tree." His voice carried the particular certainty of a man who has seen many things tried. "It grows a quarter-inch a year, Mrs. Lindqvist. It moves, it pushes. It'll tear your walls apart in 3 seasons." "I have heard this," I told him. He shook his head. "Nobody builds around a living thing. The only honest advice I have is to sell to Ward and let him deal with the problem." He rode on. I watched him go. Behind me, Clara tugged the hem of my apron and asked with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are difficult, "Where will we sleep when the rain comes?" The rains came to this valley every October. 45 inches a year, most of it between October and May, a heavy, persistent Pacific rain that came in off the coast and had nowhere to stop until it hit the Cascades. A cedar shake cabin required $85 of hauled lumber to build. I had 87 in the tin box. I had 8 days of wagon food left. I had 2 children, a debt I had not yet figured out how to clear, and a tree I had decided in the space of 1 palm against bark that I was not going to sell. I knelt down. I put myself at eye level with my daughter. I had never lied to Clara. And I had decided early in her life that I never would because she had a particular sensitivity to the gap between what adults said and what they meant the way some children are born with perfect pitch. I told her the truth. I do not know yet where we will sleep when the rain comes, but I will know by sundown tomorrow. Eli slipped his hand into mine. He had not done that for several months. He had been conducting himself with a 7-year-old's version of the stoicism he believed the situation required, which broke my heart more consistently than anything else in those 14 months. This child who had appointed himself the man of our household before he had lost all his baby teeth. His grip was stronger than I expected. I stood up and I looked up into the oak, and because I was Halvard's daughter, because I had grown up learning to see a structure where other people saw only material, I did not see a problem. I saw a frame. I saw 8 radial beams spreading from a center collar, a circular floor walls that moved with the trunk instead of fighting it. I saw what my father would have seen. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the wagon lantern with a piece of flat slate I had found at the creek edge and a charcoal stub, and I drew. My father had always told me to start with the spine, then the ribs, then the skin. I drew the oak at the center of the slate, just a circle for the trunk, the way you draw a mast in the center of a whole plan. Then I drew the 4 main branches as horizontal supports the load-bearing members, each one a proven beam that had been curing for a century and a half and would cure for centuries more. Across those branches, I drew 8 radial beams, 6 by 6, 14 feet long, spreading outward like the ribs of a ship laid upside down. A circular floor, walls of split cedar tongue and groove that would be attached to the floor frame and to each other, but never to the trunk. The trunk would pass through the center of the room inside a cedar collar fitted loose around it with a 2-inch gap on every side to allow for growth. Oak dowel pegs everywhere a nail might otherwise go. No iron touching the tree. The collar was the problem every carpenter would identify. How do you attach a floor to a collar that has to float? The answer was the same answer my father had given me when I was 10 years old, asking how a hull that bends with the sea can also hold its shape. You build the flex into the joint. You design for movement. A house that is meant to stand still will crack. A house that is designed to move with what it is built on will hold. By dawn, I had the design. The concept was complete. The math was in my head in the language of proportion and load that my father had put there when I was too young to know I was being educated. By dawn, I also had a letter. It had come with the mail wagon from Portland 2 days before, and I had not opened it because I recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and I was afraid of what the handwriting meant. It was my sister's hand. Sigrid, 2 years younger than me, the one who had stayed on the East Coast when I came west with Thomas, who had married a man named Nils and lived in a small house in Connecticut, and written me 4 letters a year for 12 years with the regularity of a person who considers correspondence a form of faithfulness. I had not heard from her in 6 months. The envelope had been sitting in the tin box with the money, and every morning for 2 days I had looked at it and put it back and done something else. I opened it by lantern light again when the slate drawing was finished. I read it once, then twice, then set it down on the slate and put both hands over my face. I did not cry because Eli was sleeping 10 feet away, and Eli had been carrying more than a 7-year-old should carry, and I would not wake him with a sound he could not fix. Niels was dead. He had booked passage on a cargo vessel out of Boston in the spring, planning to come west and find me to bring Sigrid with him, because the house in Connecticut had been lost to debt, and there was nothing left on the East Coast for either of them. The ship had gone down in a spring storm off the Atlantic seaboard. Niels had not survived. Sigrid had written the letter from a boarding house in Boston. She had buried a husband she could not visit. She had the letter implied without stating in the specific implication of a woman who knows her sister will understand without being told. Lost something else as well, a child she had been carrying, 3 months along. The cold, she wrote, and then stopped, and the stopping said the rest. She was coming to Oregon anyway. She had no one else. She would arrive by late October, she wrote, perhaps sooner if she found an earlier passage. She asked only whether I had room. I sat by the lantern until the sky went gray. I kept arriving at the same thought: my sister is coming to find me living in a wagon. Then I would leave that thought and arrive at another: my sister is coming to find me living in a tree. I picked up the charcoal. I drew a second bed on the floor of the circular plan. Then, because I had moved past grief into the cold, clear place where necessity becomes architecture, I drew a third. Because Sigrid would have a child again someday. I did not know when. I did not know how. But Halvard's daughters built for the weather that was coming, not just the weather that was here. By mid-morning, I had walked half a mile downstream to find the woman Erasmus Cole had mentioned only to dismiss. The old Kalapuya woman who lived by the creek. Strange one, he had said, keeps to herself. What Cole had not said, what he likely did not know in any real way, was the nature of her staying. Her name was Tilly. That was the name she had given to settlers who needed something to call her, a worn-down version of a name from a language that had fewer speakers with every passing decade. She was sitting on her porch, shelling last autumn's acorns into a wooden bowl, when I came up the path with Clara on my hip and Eli walking beside me with his hands in his pockets in the posture of a boy trying to look like he was accompanying someone rather than being accompanied. Tilly did not look up immediately. She shelled 4 more acorns. Then she set the bowl on her knee and looked at me with the directness of someone who has spent so long without the luxury of indirection that she has lost patience with it entirely. "You are the widow with the oak," she said. "Yes," I told her. "Sit down." I sat. Clara climbed into my lap without needing to be settled there, arranging herself with the comfort of a child who has decided this porch is safe before she has any evidence for the conclusion. Eli stood at the edge of the porch steps and watched a blue-gray bird argue with its mate in the alder trees. Along the creek, his attention performing casualness, while his ears were clearly pointed in our direction. Tilly did not ask questions for several minutes. She shelled acorns. She handed Clara one to hold, which Clara examined with the gravity of someone given a valuable object. Then Tilly said that tree was old when my grandmother's grandmother was small. Her mother's people had camped under it in autumn when the acorn harvest came in. 300 pounds some years, she said, acorns sweeter than any other oak for miles, which she attributed to the depth of its roots, which had been working their way through the clay and the rock and the mineral layers of this particular piece of Oregon ground since before Europeans had names for any of it. It fed 4 families, she said, until the settlers came and said the land was empty. "I want to build my home in it," I told her. "Not beside it, in it." She did not blink. She did not look surprised. She reached out and handed Eli an acorn too, without looking at him, which startled him into a kind of pleased confusion. Then she said, "Show me the drawing." I showed her the slate. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder whether she was reading it the way my father read a whole plan. Systematically checking proportion against proportion, looking for where the weight would go. Then she put her finger on the cedar collar and its floating gap, and she tapped twice. "This is the part everyone else will miss," she said. "Everyone else," I told her, "says I cannot build there at all." "Everyone else," Tilly said, "has never asked the tree." She stood. She walked with a slowness that was not weakness, but deliberateness to the oak, half a mile up the path. I carried Clara. Eli walked between us. When we reached the trunk, Tilly went directly to a spot on the north side, about 4 feet from the ground, where moss had grown for longer than I had been alive. She peeled the moss back with her thumbnail with the sureness of someone who has done this before, who knows what is underneath. They're cut into the living wood, almost completely healed over by the slow increment of annual growth, a mark. 2 curves and a line and a name in Kalapuya that I could not read. Tilly's voice when she spoke was level as slate. "My great-grandmother, she bore her first child under this tree in the spring of 1822. She carved her name so the oak would remember. The oak has remembered." I could not speak for a moment. Clara had gone still in my arms. Children sense the weight in adult silence, even when they cannot name it. Tilly turned to look at me, and her face held the expression of someone delivering information they had been waiting a long time to deliver to the right person. "This is a tree of women," she said. "It has held mothers who could not stand up by themselves. It has heard crying that the village was not allowed to hear. You are not the first one to come here with something you could not put down anywhere else. You will not be the last." I looked at Clara's sleeping face against my shoulder. I looked at Eli, who had gone very still at the edge of my vision, listening. I thought about Sigrid on a ship somewhere east of here, crossing toward a sister she did not yet know was living under an oak tree. I put my free hand against the bark beside the place where Tilly's great-grandmother had written her name into the wood 46 years before. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture did not say better. The next morning, I rode into Sweet Home. The following day, I rode to Eugene, which was a harder trip, longer road rougher at the end, but Eugene had a second-hand goods dealer who would give me a fair price and not ask unnecessary questions. I sold Thomas's saddle. It was a good saddle, hand-tooled, the one thing Thomas had owned that represented real craftsmanship, and selling it felt like a further subtraction from an inventory that had already lost too much. I received $19. I held the money in my palm on the ride back and did the arithmetic over again in my head, checking it the way I always check load calculations, looking for the error, verifying the margin. The next day, I sold my mother's wedding ring. This requires some explanation, though I have never given it to anyone outside this family, because the explanation is the kind that makes practical people uncomfortable. My mother had been dead for 16 years. The ring was a thin gold band, plain worn almost to paper thinness at the back from 50 years on her finger. It was the last object I owned that she had touched every day of her adult life. I had carried it in the lining of my coat through 3 moves of wagon crossing, childbirth, twice a husband's death, 14 months of widowhood. I had told myself in moments when I needed to feel like I still had something that could not be taken that I would never sell it. I sold it for $23. I put the 19 and the 23 together with what remained in the tin box and rode to the bank in Sweet Home the following morning. Whittle was behind the counter, a careful-looking man in his 50s, who gave the impression of a person who had decided long ago that his job was to handle money exactly as instructed and to feel nothing in particular about it either way. I counted out $28 in front of him. I said it was payment in full for the note on Thomas Lindqvist's feed store debt, which Mr. Ward had purchased and held. Whittle wrote the receipt slowly, as though the deliberateness of his penmanship might compensate for his visible surprise. When I walked out of the bank onto the plank sidewalk, Cornelius Ward was standing across the street. He had not been there when I went in. He had positioned himself since. He was watching the bank door with an expression that had expected something different to come out of it. Whatever he had expected, it was not me carrying a paid receipt, walking straight ahead without looking at him. I did not look at him. I felt him watching. He had stopped smiling. The arrangement with the Bjornson family had taken a separate negotiation conducted the night before by lantern light at their kitchen table, with old Eric Bjornson listening to my proposal with the patient attention of a man who has learned that some offers are stranger than they look. The Bjornsons were the nearest neighbors, a family who had been working this Oregon land longer than Thomas and I had been here, who knew the valley's patterns and the valley's people, and who had not, in 14 months, done anything to add to my difficulty, which in the circumstances counted as an act of kindness. Mrs. Bjornson's kitchen shelving had collapsed under the weight of a flour sack 3 weeks before. Eric did not have the hands for fine joinery. He was a farmer, not a woodworker, and he knew the difference. I offered to rebuild the shelving 5 tiers hardwood, pegged clean. 2 days of work. In exchange, I asked for the use of his draft horse for 1 morning. Enough seasoned lumber from his collapsed barn to make 8 6x6 beams at 14 feet, and 1 day of his labor and his eldest son's labor to help me lift the first beam into position. Eric looked at me across his kitchen table for a long moment. Then he said, "Ward will try to stop this." I told him Ward had tried already. I had paid the debt, he had only his words left. Eric nodded once slowly in the way of men who have made peace with living in a world that does not always do what it should, but occasionally does what it needs to. He told me to let him know when I needed the horse. I walked home under October stars, calculating timber lengths in my head, running the mortise dimensions against the grain direction of the available wood, planning the sequence of cuts I would need to make before the Bjornson Labor Day arrived. The first beam went up on the 8th of October. It took the better part of a morning with the draft horse doing the heavy lifting and Eric's son holding the far end steady, while I drove the oak pegs into the pre-cut seats I had carved over the preceding 3 days. The beam seated flush into the branch cradle at 12 feet. It did not wobble. It did not rock. It sat the way a well-made thing sits, as though it had always been there, as though the tree had been waiting for it. I climbed down the ladder. I stood on the ground. I looked up at the beam, and the afternoon light came through the canopy and lay across the new wood in a way that made it look like it had been growing there since the tree was young. Eli stood beside me. He had spent the morning handing tools up the ladder in the order I asked for them, without being asked twice, without complaint, without the performance of patience that children sometimes produce when they are performing rather than actually patient. He was just there, steady, passing things up the way a good apprentice stands beside a craftsman, present without interference. "Mama," he said, looking up at the beam. "Yes, Grandpa would like that." I could not answer him immediately. When I did, my voice was steadier than I expected. "Yes," I told him. "Your grandfather would like that very much." The days that followed had a rhythm that surprised me with its capacity to hold the weight of what I was doing. I rose before the children. I lit the wagon lantern. I worked through the pre-dawn hours on the cedar collar, which had to be fitted precisely. The gap uniform all the way around the inner face smooth enough that when the collar needed to expand, it would slide without catching. The collar was the heart of the design. Everything else could be adjusted, repaired, modified. The collar had to be right the first time. Tilly came 3 times in those first 2 weeks. She came without announcement and left without ceremony, walking up the path in the early afternoon with her particular unhurried gait, and sitting near the base of the tree and watching me work the way you watch someone do something you already understand and do not need to comment on. On her second visit, she showed Clara how to sort the acorns that had fallen, which ones were sound, which had the small hole of a weevil, which were still green enough to need drying. Clara took this instruction with complete seriousness, establishing a sorting system on a flat rock that she maintained with the dedication of a person who has been given important work and knows it. She announced that she was the acorn girl. She said this with a finality that it suggested the title was not negotiable. Tilly watched Clara sort and said without particular emphasis, "Those acorns from that tree will make flour that tastes different from any other oak flour you have used. Sweeter. The tree puts something into them that other oaks don't." I don't know what the white word for it would be. I asked whether there was a Kalapuya word. She considered this. "The word doesn't translate," she said. "It means something like what a place gives to what grows in it over a long enough time." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon while I worked. Ward rode past on the 21st of October. I was under the oak, sitting on the ground with the children drawing in the dirt with a stick, working through the load calculations for the third beam. From the road, what Ward saw was a widow sitting in the dirt with her children. No foundation trench, no stone pile, no lumber stacked on the ground, no visible evidence of construction. His foreman Doyle was with him, and I heard Ward say something in a low voice, and then Doyle laughed, and then they rode on. What Ward did not see, because he did not look up, was the collar already in place. He did not see the first beam seated in the branch. He did not see the charcoal marks on the underside of the second branch precisely positioned, measuring the mortise I would cut the following morning. He saw the ground. He saw a woman sitting on the ground. He read the ground for meaning and found what he expected to find, which was defeat. The second beam went in the next day, and the third the day after that. By the end of October, I had 4 beams in place, the collar seated, and 8 feet of flooring laid in a half circle. The boards were not finished grade. I did not have finished grade material, and I did not have time. But they were sound, they were level. I had checked them with a water-filled tube that my father had shown me was more accurate than any level I could afford, and they were right within the tolerance that mattered. On the morning of the 1st of November, I went to retrieve the letter from the tin box and read it again, not because I had forgotten what it said, but because I needed to read it with the blueprint in front of me. Sigrid would arrive any day now, perhaps that very week. The house would not be finished. The house might not have walls yet, depending on how the beamwork went, but it would have a floor. It would have a structure. It would have a place where my sister could stand 12 feet off the ground and feel something under her feet that was not a ship deck, something that was not going to move, something rooted into Oregon ground that had been holding itself together since before either of us was born. I read the letter again, the part about the ship, the part about Niels, the part about the child she had been carrying. I thought about Sigrid, the way you think about someone you love who is suffering and whom you cannot yet reach, with the particular frustration of a woman who solves things by building them, faced with a grief she could not build her way out of. I thought about what Tilly had said. This is a tree of women who could not stand up by themselves. I picked up the charcoal stub. I went back to the slate. I looked at the third bed I had drawn in the early hours of the first morning, and I made it a little larger. Then I looked at the chair I had sketched in the corner, the one I had placed beside the west-facing window, in the plan the window that would look toward the Cascade Gap, and I thought about what Eli had said to me once months before when I had asked him what he remembered most about the evenings before his father got sick. He had said Papa used to sit by the window in the late afternoon. He liked to watch the light change on the mountains. He said a person who has seen hard things needs a place to sit and look at something that goes on anyway. My son had said that. My 7-year-old son who watched my hands instead of my face. I drew the chair with more care than I had given it before. I made the lines clean, the proportions right. I gave it a back that would support a person sitting for a long time. I gave it arms. I put it in the corner by the window that would face west, and I thought, Eli, we are going to build your aunt a chair by the window. I promise you this, though I am going to build it first and tell you about it later, because some promises are easier to keep than to make. On the 1st of November in the early afternoon, the wagon from the Portland Road stopped at the end of my track. A woman climbed down from the bench without waiting for the driver to assist her. She was thinner than I remembered, thinner than seemed right. Her dark coat hung on her frame with the looseness of a garment made for someone who no longer quite inhabited the size she had been. Her cheeks had hollowed. Her hair, which had been the same pale color as mine when we were girls in Maine, had a gray streak at the left temple that had not been there in the last photograph she had sent. She was 32 years old. She looked older than that in the way that grief ages people differently than time does. Not by adding years so much as by removing something, some quality of forward-lookingness that youth carries in its face without knowing it is carrying it. She did not run toward me. She stood beside the wagon and looked at me, then at the children, then past all of us, at the oak, at the collar, and the 4 beams in the half-laid floor, visible 12 feet in the air above the ground. Marin, she said, what is that? Our house, I told her. That is a tree. Our house is in it. She looked at the ladder leaning against the trunk. She looked at the cedar floor barely visible through the branches. She looked at the lantern I had left hanging from a peg on the second branch the previous evening, because I had come down in a hurry and forgotten it, and there it still hung, swaying slightly in the November wind. She looked for a long time, then she said very quietly in the flat tone of someone delivering an honest assessment rather than a criticism, you have lost your mind. I have not, I told her. You have, she said, Marin, you have. We walked to the oak. Eli took Clara by the hand and walked the other direction toward Tilly's cabin, because Eli was 7 years old and had already developed the instinct from 14 months of close observation for when adult women needed to be left alone with whatever they needed to be alone with. My sister and I stood under that canopy. She asked how much money I had. I told her $62 after paying Thomas's debt. She said that was not enough for a real cabin. I agreed. She said then this was why I was doing this, because I could not afford a real house. I told her no. I was doing it because a real house could not be built on this ground, because the only flat surface belonged to the tree, because the tree could hold us if we were willing to understand the way it needed to be held. She pressed her palm against her eyes. She had been on ships for 9 weeks. She had eaten flour and water. She had buried a husband she could not visit. She had lost, and here her voice stopped and started again lower. She had lost the child she was carrying on the water 3 months along. The doctor on board had said the cold was too much. She had not written the full truth in the letter. She was saying it now. I reached for her. She stepped back, not dramatically, just a small, precise withdrawal. Don't, she said. She told me she had come because there was nowhere else to go. She had thought there would be a cabin. She had thought there would be a roof. She had found a rock slope with her niece sorting acorns and her sister climbing a tree with a chisel. She said, I will not watch you die for a dream the way Father did. Father did not die for a dream, I told her. A scaffold broke. A scaffold he built, she said. A scaffold he trusted. Her voice was not angry. It was something more final than anger, something that had been held too long to still be hot. She said she wanted me to sell the land, take the money, go east to Minnesota, find a community, find a church, find a house with 4 walls in the right order. She said she would take Eli and Clara and raise them herself in a town where women did not climb trees. The word she used was sensible. I looked at my sister. I looked at her coat hanging on her frame. I looked at the gray at her temple that had not been there a year ago. I told her I am not going east. But she did not have to decide tonight. She could eat with us. She could sleep with us. She could stay as long as she needed. If in 1 month she still wanted to go east, she would go. And the children, she asked. My throat closed. The children, I told her, would stay with me. She looked at the tree. Her eyes changed for just a moment. I saw it, the flicker of something that was not agreement, but was not the refusal that had been there before. She was looking at the joinery. She was looking the way Halvard had taught both of us to look at joinery, with the systematic attention that checks proportion against proportion, that looks for where the load goes. She had not forgotten how to look. Then she closed her eyes and turned her face away. I will stay the week, she said. Thank you, I told her. I am not agreeing to anything, I know. That night, when the children were asleep, I walked back to the oak alone. The moon was a thin crescent above the Cascades, giving enough light to see the outline of the collar, the shadow of the first beam against the bark. I put my palm against the north side of the trunk beside the mark that Tilly's great-grandmother had cut in 1822. And I stood there for a while without speaking, just feeling the bark in the slow underground pulse of a thing that had been alive for 300 years and intended to be alive for 300 more. A small sound came from behind me. I turned. Sigrid stood at the edge of the canopy. She was in her nightdress, her dark coat over her shoulders, her feet bare on the November ground. She had not come close. She stood where the tree's shadow met the moonlit grass, and she was looking up at the collar, at the beams, at the floor, catching the thin light. She had not seen me. I did not move. I watched my sister raise one hand, slowly without looking away from the structure above her. She pressed her palm against the bark. I watched her mouth open. I heard her, just barely heard her, say one word. I could not tell whose name it was, her husband's, her father's. Maybe not a name at all. Maybe just the word please, which contains all three when you say it in the dark to something older than your grief. A single dry oak leaf spiraled down from the canopy. It landed in the curve of her open palm. She stood with it for a long moment. Then she closed her hand around it. She turned and walked back toward the wagon without looking back. I stayed under the oak until I could no longer feel my feet. Then I went to bed. In the morning, the ladder was where I had left it. The collar was where I had put it. The charcoal marks were on the fourth beam seat, waiting for the mortise cut. The slate drawing was on the shelf beside the tools. On that same shelf, placed without comment, sometime between the middle of the night and the first gray of morning, was a dry oak leaf folded closed, holding its own shape. Sigrid was already up. She was standing at the base of the ladder with 2 empty water pails, looking not at the ladder but up the path toward the creek. Where is the water, she said. Not a question, a preparation. Half a mile north, I told her. She went. She took Eli with her, which she did not ask about, and he did not resist. She came back with 2 full pails. She set them at the base of the oak. She went back for more. She did not look at the ladder on the way past, and she did not look at the floor above, and she did not say anything to me about the night before or the leaf or the words she had said to the tree in the dark. She simply carried water with the focused practicality of someone who has decided that one task done correctly is worth more right now than any number of unresolved, larger questions. I climbed the ladder, I picked up the chisel, I began cutting the fourth mortise. Below me, Sigrid set down the second pails and looked up, just for a moment. Her expression in that brief upward glance was unguarded. The face of someone looking at something she has not yet decided what to think about, which is different from the face of someone who has decided against it. I had learned to read my sister's face the way I had learned to read joinery, by looking for where the stress was going. The stress, I thought, was beginning to move. Sigrid carried water for 3 days without speaking about anything that mattered. She rose before the children and took the pails from their hook beside the wagon wheel, walked a half-mile to the creek with Eli beside her, returned with both pails full, set them at the base of the oak, and went back for more. She did this 4 times in the morning and twice in the afternoon, which was more water than we needed for drinking and cooking. I recognized what she was doing. I had spent the first 6 weeks after Thomas died cooking food that no one was hungry for because the motion of cooking was something my body could do, while the rest of me figured out how to continue existing. I did not say any of this to Sigrid. Some things you let a person do until they are ready to do something else. On the second afternoon, I came down from the platform to sharpen the chisel, which had dulled on a particularly resistant section of the fourth beam's mortise. I came around the base of the trunk and found Sigrid standing at the shelf where I kept the slate drawing. She was not glancing at it. She was studying it. Her left index finger moved slowly along the line I had drawn for the collar, tracing the 2-inch gap, then moving up to where the radial beams joined the center ring. Her lips were moving in the way lips move when someone is running numbers, silently checking arithmetic, verifying load distribution. She was reading the plan the way Halbert had taught both of us to read plans. Not looking at the lines, but looking through them at what the lines implied about how force would move through the structure. She heard me come around the trunk. She stepped back from the shelf with the specific speed of someone caught doing something they had claimed they were not doing. Her expression reset itself. "I was not looking," she said. "I saw you looking. I was not." "Sigrid." I set the chisel on the workbench. "It is all right. I am still leaving," she said. Her voice was flat, neither aggressive nor pleading. Just a statement of position. "I know." She walked away across the clearing, toward the wagon, and I let her go because the finger moving along the load line had told me something her words were still refusing to say. That evening after supper, after Clara had fallen asleep over a half-eaten bowl of acorn porridge, and Eli had carried her to her bedroll with the practiced care of a boy who had done this before Sigrid asked a question. She was looking at the wagon boards, not at me. "Why 2 inches?" Not phrased as a question, stated as a problem she wanted solved. I told her the trunk grows a 1/4 inch per year. In 8 years, that is 2 inches. The collar has to have room to float outward as the tree expands, or the pressure of the growing wood will crack the cedar. The joint has to anticipate the movement and welcome it rather than resist it. She was quiet for a moment. "The pegs." "Oak," I told her, Hannon turned. "They swell in rain because wood absorbs moisture. They contract in dry weather. The swelling locks them in wet seasons when the structure is under greatest stress from rain load and wind. The drying season is when you do your fine adjustments. It is a system that works with the climate rather than against it." Sigrid nodded once the single downward motion that I had seen her make since she was 12 years old, whenever she had received information that she was integrating rather than discarding. She said nothing more. She went to her bedroll. Eli from across the wagon caught my eye in the dim light and held it for a moment. Then he said quietly, so as not to carry Mama, "Aunt Sigrid is reading the drawing." Yes, I said. Papa used to read drawings that way. He would stand in front of them for a long time and his lips would move a little. Yes, grandfather must have read them that way too. He did. Eli considered this with the methodical patience he brought to most things. Maybe she is not leaving, he said. I did not answer. Hope was the most expensive thing I own, and I had learned to spend it carefully. The fifth beam went in on the 10th of November, 9 days after Sigrid's arrival. This was the one I had been anxious about. It required a longer reach from the collar ring, and the branch it seated on had a slight downward cant that I needed to compensate for in the mortise angle. I had been calculating the correction for 2 days. I cut the mortise at 7 in the morning, checked it twice with my fingertips, and once with a straight edge I had made from a true piece of scrap cedar, then called for Eli to man the measuring line while I climbed with the beam. Sigrid was at the creek with the water pails. The beam seated on the first attempt. Not perfectly. I had overcorrected by half a degree and had to come back down, take a thin pass with the rasp along the high side of the mortise, go back up. But on the second seating it was right. I drove the oak dowels in pairs, feeling each one find its channel and grip. When I came down the ladder the second time, Sigrid was standing at the base of the oak with the water pail set down beside her, looking up at the new beam. She did not look at me. She looked at the beam for a long moment. Then she picked up the pails and walked toward the wagon. But her pace had changed from what it had been. It was not the pace of someone walking away from something. It was the pace of someone who needed to be somewhere else for a minute while they thought. The day Clara fell was the fourth day after Sigrid's arrival. She had decided with the complete seriousness of a 5-year-old who has been given important work that being the acorn girl was not enough. She wanted to also be the water girl. She had watched Eli manage the pails often enough to believe she understood the mechanics of it. She had not understood that the pails, when full, weighed nearly half what she did. She made it 20 feet up the slope from the creek bank before her grip gave, and both pails went over, soaking her feet the path in the small patch of dignity she had assembled around her new identity as a household contributor. She sat down in the mud. She did not produce the performative cry of a child seeking attention. She cried with the particular desolation of a very small person who has tried very hard at something real and failed at it in front of no one, which is somehow worse than failing in front of people because there is not even the comfort of an audience for the effort. I was 12 feet up at the sixth beam seat when I heard it. I started for the ladder. I did not reach the base before Sigrid reached Clara. My sister crossed the clearing at a run the first time I had seen her move faster than a deliberate walk since she arrived. She dropped to her knees in the mud without any visible concern for what the mud would do to her skirt. She pulled Clara into her lap. For a moment she said nothing, just held the child, and I stood on the second rung of the ladder and watched my sister's face do something complicated. "Little one," Sigrid said. Her voice had dropped to the register she had used when they were very small, when Sigrid was 8 and I was 10, and we shared a bedroom in our father's house in Maine, and she would use that voice in the dark when I couldn't sleep. "You do not have to carry the water, but I want to help." Clara's voice was the voice of someone with a genuinely legitimate grievance. "I know you do. I am the acorn girl." A brief pause. "I wanted to also be the water girl." "I will carry the water," Sigrid said. "You be the acorn girl. We will each do the thing we are made for. That is how a family runs." Her voice was steady, practical, deliberate. The voice of someone choosing words because the words were true, not because they were comforting. That is what your grandmother used to say to your mother and me when we were small and wanted to do everything at once. Clara sniffled. "Grandmother said that. She said it often. Mama never told me." Sigrid looked up then. Her eyes came up and found mine. Her expression was not warm exactly, not open, but something in it had shifted from the position it had held for 4 days. She said not to Clara, but in my direction, in a tone that was neither accusation nor apology, but something more neutral than either. There are things our mother said that Marin has forgotten. I will tell them to the children. That can be my work. I had to look away. I looked up at the beam seat I had been working on at the chalk marks I had made that morning at the grain of the oak, catching the November light. I let my face do what it needed to do up there where the canopy would absorb it. Sigrid lifted Clara. She carried her to the wagon, set her on the running board, cleaned the mud from her face with a cloth dampened from the morning's water, braided her hair back into order. Then she picked up both pails. She walked to the base of the oak ladder. She looked up, not at the beam, not at the platform, but up the ladder itself at each rung in sequence, the way you look at something you have been deciding about for a while and have now decided. She put her foot on the first rung. I stayed on the ground. This was not the moment for me to be 12 feet above her looking down. This was the moment to stay exactly where I was and be as still as possible, the way you stay still when something is coming towards you that will turn around if you move too fast. She climbed. She climbed all the way to the top, stepped off onto the cedar floor, stood on the platform 12 feet above the organ ground. She turned in a slow, full circle. I could not see her face clearly from below, only the line of her shoulders and the movement of her head as she turned. She pressed her palm against the living trunk where it rose through the center of what would become the main room. She stood like that for a long time, palm flat against the bark, and I thought about the night 3 days before when she had done the same thing in the dark without knowing I was watching. When she came down, she did not speak immediately. She walked to the tool shelf. She took down the chisel, the good one, the one my father had left me, the one with the handle worn smooth from 40 years in a Maine boat builder's hand. She set it across her palm, feeling the weight and the balance. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at me. "Show me where the next Mordice is," she said. "Sigrid, show me Marin. Are you—" "I am not agreeing to anything." Her voice had the specific firmness of someone who has drawn a line and will not move it even if they are walking toward it. "I am only cutting one mortise. Show me." I showed her. She made the first cut with the authority of someone who had not lost the knowledge, only set it aside. The kind of skill that lives in the body below the level of conscious decision that reasserts itself the moment the hands are given the correct tool. The mortise seated clean. She did not cry. But when she climbed back down and walked to the tool shelf to sharpen the chisel, I saw her turn her face aside and press the back of her wrist against it quickly, the gesture of someone taking care of something private before anyone notices it needs taking care of. I stayed on the platform. I looked up through the canopy at the November sky, pale blue and clear, above the oak's remaining leaves. I spoke to my father in the only way I had left to speak to him, which was to say something true out loud in a place where saying it might do some good. "She came back," I told him. "She came back, Papa." Sigrid stayed. She did not say she was staying. She did not unpack her bag from the wagon bed. She did not agree to anything. She only kept cutting mortises. 2 in the first week after the ladder climb, 3 the week after. By mid-November, she was cutting them faster than I was because she had remembered something she had known before she set it down, that precision comes back quicker than people expect when the hands have done the work long enough that the body carries it like memory. Eli cut his first 3 chalk pegs in the 3rd week of November, small ones, for the secondary attachment points, where the floorboards met the radial beams at the perimeter. His cuts were not clean, and I told him so directly, which he received without injury and addressed by slowing down and thinking about each stroke before making it. By the 4th peg, his cuts had improved enough for me to say so, which was praise enough for a child who had inherited his grandfather's understanding that the work itself was the measure. Clara processed acorns with Tilly every afternoon. Tilly came to the clearing without announcing herself, spread a piece of woven plant fiber on the flat rock beside the south root, and set up the handstone and the grinding hollow that she had carried from her cabin. Clara sat across from her and learned the motion, steady circular pressure, not back and forth, which wasted effort. Circular, maintaining contact through the full revolution. The flour that came from this was different from any flour I had used, finer with a slight sweetness underneath the earthiness. We ate it as porridge, as flat bread cooked on the wagon's small iron plate, as thickening for the broth from the two rabbits Tilly showed Eli how to snare. Ward rode past twice in October. I noted both times by the sound of hooves on the track, and I noted what he would have seen each time he looked toward the plot: a woman and sometimes two women doing things at ground level, children nearby. No conventional construction visible from the road. The construction was visible from underneath the canopy, from 12 feet up, from anywhere that required looking in the right direction. Ward did not look in the right direction. He looked where he expected to see what he expected to see, and what he expected to see was either a construction that could be interfered with or the absence of one that confirmed his original assessment. What he did not see, a cedar collar fully fitted, floating on a living trunk with a 2-inch gap on every side. 8 radio beams seated in carved branch cradles. 40% of the floor decking laid in tongue and groove pattern. The chalk marks for the first wall studs already drawn on the beam ends ready for cutting. On the first Sunday of November, Margaret Ward came up the road alone. She was on foot in a shawl that was insufficient for the temperature, carrying a covered basket. I had seen her twice in Sweet Home, both times from a distance, both times in the composed stillness of a woman who has made a practice of not drawing attention to herself in public. Today she did not look composed. She looked like someone who had left the house without entirely meaning to, and had arrived somewhere without entirely planning it. She stopped at the edge of the oak's canopy. She did not call up to the platform. She stood with the basket in both hands, looking at the ground, and then without sitting down, she began to cry. Not loudly, with none of the drama of performed grief, but with the small, constrained sound of someone who has been crying quietly for so long that loud has become unavailable to her. I came down the ladder. Sigrid came down behind me, having heard the sound from the other side of the platform where she had been working. We did not ask Margaret what had brought her. We did not explain that this was unexpected or ask whether there was something we could do. We sat down under the oak with her, one on each side, and we waited with her the way you wait with someone when the only thing they need is not to be alone with whatever they are carrying. After a long time, Margaret said to the ground between her feet, "I have lost 3 children, Mrs. Lindqvist, all 3 before they were born. My husband has believed for 20 years that this is my fault. I came here because Grandmother Tilly told me this was a tree for women who have lost something." A pause. "I told her that was Indian talk, which I am ashamed of now. She told me anyway. I didn't believe her." Another pause shorter. "Today I did not know where else to go." Sigrid moved first. My sister, who had not touched either of my children more than briefly since arriving, who had held herself at a careful arm's length from everything that might require her to open the parts of herself she was still trying to keep closed, put her arms around Margaret Ward and held her. She held her the way you hold someone when you are not thinking about holding them, when the body moves before the mind can introduce its reservations. "You came to the right place," Sigrid said. "Next Sunday, come back. The tree has room." Margaret looked up at the canopy, at the underside of the platform above us, at the living trunk rising through its center. Something in her face shifted. Not resolved, not healed, but moved the way a long stuck thing moves when the right pressure is finally applied to the correct point. She came back the following Sunday with bread. The Sunday after that with bread again, and a small jar of late honey from her own hives. The Sunday after that, Tilly was there when she arrived. The 4 of us sat under the tree. Sometimes we talked about the children, the ones who had been lost, the ones who were present, the ones who might come. Sometimes we said nothing for long stretches, which is a different kind of conversation, one that requires more trust. On a Tuesday in the second week of November, Clara woke with a fever. I had nursed Eli through 3 fevers in his life, and I knew the taxonomy of them, the ordinary kind that ran its course in 2 days and left the child tired but intact. The kind that needed watching but not panic. The kind you recognized in the first hours by something you could not name precisely, but that registered in the body as distinct from the others. This one, by mid-afternoon, had become the third kind. Clara's skin moved through temperatures too fast. Her color shifted in ways that were not the normal red-cheeked flush, but something more complex, less certain. By evening, she had stopped accepting water. By nightfall, she was speaking words that did not connect to anything in the room. Sigrid took the position beside the cot that I would have taken and did not give it up. She sat with her back straight and a cloth in her hand and worked the creek water across Clara's forehead and the back of her neck in the steady rotation of someone who has converted attention into a physical practice. She did not look up when I came in from outside. She said to the cot rather than to me, "Marin, this is a chest fever. I have seen this kind." She stopped. I knew what she had seen on the ship. I knew the specific fever she was describing because she had seen it take something that could not be replaced. I did not ask her to finish the sentence. I knelt beside her on the floor. Eli appeared in the doorway. He was in his nightclothes, his feet bare on the cold floor, his face arranged with the terrible composure of a 7-year-old who has learned to manage fear by managing his expression. He said, "Mama, is Clara going to?" Sigrid spoke before I could. "Aunt Sigrid is tired, Eli. Go to the wagon. I will come get you if anything changes." Her voice was even calibrated, not warm but steady, which was what the moment required. He went. I sat beside my sister. Her hand on the cloth was shaking slightly, which she did not acknowledge. I said, "The nearest doctor is in Albany, 12 miles. She said, "How much?" I told her $10 approximately for the ride and the fee. She said, "How much do you have?" 52, I told her after the debt payment in the lumber agreement with Bjornson. She said, "Then go." I said, "Sigrid, if I paid $10, I have 42 left for the winter, for all of it." She said, "Marin, go." I was reaching for my coat when the knock came at the shed door. The knock was Ward. He stood in the doorway, his face composed into an expression of such practiced reasonableness that it looked almost genuine. Almost. He said he had heard about the Child Sweet Home was a small town and a sick child was news that traveled, and he was deeply sorry. He said he had only come to help. He said he would send his man Doyle to Albany tonight, that Dr. Fenn would be here by morning with whatever was needed. In exchange, my signature on the deed. $40, myself, my children, my sister, all of us could remain in the tool shed through the winter. He was not, he said, a cruel man. He was a practical one. He had brought the deed with him. He had walked to the bedside of a feverish child with the paperwork already drawn up, already signed on his side, needing only my name on the remaining line. I looked at it in his hand. I looked at Clara's face on the cot, the color of it, the stillness of it, that was not the stillness of sleep. I looked at the slate drawing on the shelf, the collar, the beams, the chair I had drawn beside the west window. I looked at the chisel my father had left me. I reached for the pen. Ward was already extending the small, smooth motion of a man who has done this before and knows the precise moment to complete it. Sigrid's voice came from the cot. One word, the consonant sharp no. Her voice cracked on it, just fractionally at the end of the vowel. The crack of something under more stress than its tensile strength was designed for. But the word itself did not crack. The word was solid. Ward turned his attention to Sigrid with the patient warmth of a man who believes every objection has a price. "Mrs. Nielsen, I understand you have recently suffered a loss of your own. I am very, sir." Sigrid's voice had dropped below the crack to something else, something that had been on the other side of the grief all along, and was now for the first time since she arrived in Oregon, fully audible. "I do not know you. Step out of this shed." He stepped back. He did not leave entirely. He stood just outside the doorway, visible in the lantern light, waiting. Sigrid turned to me. Her face was the color of the wall behind her, but her eyes had gone to the specific quality they had held when she was a girl of 16, and our cousin had tried to take something of hers by force, and she had stood between him and what was hers with exactly this expression. Some knowledge lives below words. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were not. She reached to the back of her neck. She unclipped the chain that had rested under her collar, hidden under every shirt and dress since she had left the East Coast 9 weeks before. She laid it on the workbench. A small gold cross, plain the edges worn thin, by what must have been decades on the neck of Nils's grandmother before it passed to his mother before it came to Sigrid on their wedding day. The chain was fine as spider thread. It was the only thing the sea had not taken. "Ride to Eugene tonight," Sigrid said. "The pawn dealer on 2nd Street will give you $15 for this. Bring Dr. Fenn back with you." "Sigrid, that is Nils's. Marin." She took my face in both her hands. I had not been held like that in 15 months. Her palms were cold from the cloth. "Niels died believing he would find you. He died believing he would hold your children. He died believing he would hold ours." Her voice broke on the last word in a way that was different from the earlier break. This was not structural failure, but deliberate opening, a controlled release of something that had been sealed too long. If he could see me sitting beside his last thing around my neck, while you signed our father's work over to a man like that, he would climb out of the Atlantic seaboard and come find me himself. She pressed the cross into my palm. She closed my fingers over it. Her hands over mine were steadier than I expected. "Go," she said. "I will not let go of her hand. I will be here when you come back. Go, Marin." I went. The pawn dealer in Eugene gave me $14, not $15. I did not have time to negotiate. Dr. Fenn was in Albany, not Eugene, which added an hour. He came without arguing when I explained the situation and showed him the money. We arrived back at the clearing at 7 in the morning. He examined Clara for 10 minutes, the careful, unhurried examination of a man who has learned that haste in diagnosis costs more than the minutes it saves. His assessment: secondary fever following respiratory infection, likely from the creek air, which ran cold and damp off the higher elevation snowpack this time of year. Severe dehydration. Willow bark tincture fluids, cold compresses, continued. She should live if the fever breaks in the next 12 hours. He looked at me over the cot. "If it does not break, Mrs. Lindqvist, I am sorry." He left the tincture. He took his fee. He rode back to Albany. Tilly arrived at noon without being sent for, which meant she had been watching for the doctor's horse and had timed her walk accordingly. She came into the shed, looked at Clara, looked at me, set her basket on the workbench beside the chisel. She said the doctor's medicine was good. Then she said she had something that worked with it rather than against it. From the basket, strips of inner bark, dried roots tied with grass, a small pouch of gray-green powder. She boiled water on the shed stove. She made a tea the color of wet creek stone and a thick poultice that she applied to Clara's chest, working with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that the procedure has become below conscious thought. Sigrid watched from the cot side. "Will it harm her?" "No," Tilly said. "Will it help her?" Tilly was quiet for a moment. "Yes, if the child wants to stay." Sigrid's hand tightened on the blanket edge until her knuckles changed color. "Then give it to her." We sat by the cot for the rest of that day and into the night. I lost track of the hours in the way you lose track of time when all of your attention has narrowed to a single point. The rise and fall of a small chest. The temperature of a small forehead under a damp cloth. The quality of light coming through the shed window, shifting from afternoon to evening to the absolute dark of a rural November night. Eli came at dusk. Sigrid sent him back to the wagon, but told him she would call him if anything changed, and the specificity of the promise, not just a dismissal but a commitment, was what made him go. At 2 in the morning, in the deepest hour, Clara opened her eyes. They were clear. Not the clouded, half-present eyes of the fever hours, but the direct, focused eyes of a child who knows exactly where she is and has a question. She looked at Sigrid, who was bent over the cot with the cloth still in her hand, and she said in a voice that was thin but entirely her own, "Aunt Sigrid, is the tree okay?" The sound Sigrid made was one I had never heard from her before and have not heard since. The compound sound of a person whose grief and relief have collided at speed, producing something that was neither crying nor laughter, but contained both a sound that came from somewhere below the chest. She pressed her free hand over her mouth. She kept the other hand on Clara's forehead. When she could speak, she said, "Yes, little one. The tree is fine. The tree is perfectly fine." Clara closed her eyes. She slept. The fever broke before dawn, the temperature dropping in the gradual way that means the body has won, rather than given up, the slow retreat of something that has decided to leave, rather than the sudden absence of something that has been defeated. By first light, she was sleeping the deep, still sleep of a child who has been through something and come out the other side and now simply needs the rest of it. Sigrid had not left the cot in 12 hours. When the gray light came through the shed window and it was clear that the danger had moved past, I touched my sister's shoulder. She stood up slowly with the stiffness of someone who has held a position too long, past the point where the body asks to be released from it. We walked outside together. The November morning was cold in the specific Oregon way, damp, and still the kind of cold that sits on the skin rather than cutting through it. The Cascades were invisible behind a low layer of cloud that sat on the peaks and pressed the sky down close. We sat on the shed's front step. We did not speak for several minutes. I could hear Clara breathing through the shed's thin wall, the sound regular and deep, the sound of someone who had decided to keep going. Sigrid said, "Marin." I waited. Yes, she was looking at the mountain line where the Cascades should have been, at the cloud layer that had swallowed them. "I am not leaving." A long pause. "I am not going east. I am not taking the children. I am not—" Her voice stopped, started again. "I am not agreeing to anything." "I know," I said. "I am only staying." "I know, Sigrid." She put her head on my shoulder. She was 32 years old, and she had crossed half a continent alone and buried a husband she could not visit, and lost a child in the cold of the Atlantic, and carried water in pails for a week and sat beside a feverish niece for 12 straight hours, refusing to leave. And she was the same girl who had slept in the bed across from mine in our father's house in Maine when we were small, the one who had whispered across the dark room when neither of us could sleep. She cried quietly with the complete exhaustion of someone who has held everything together for as long as it needed to be held together and has now reached the other side of the need. I held her. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the holding did not say more completely. At breakfast in the wagon, after the children had eaten, and Clara had eaten the most of any of us, with the appetite of someone who has recently demonstrated the value of keeping a body going, Eli climbed into my lap. He was 7 years old, and he had not done this since his father died, and he had appointed himself the household's man. But he climbed in and I let him, because some appointments are made by circumstance and can be unmade by the same. He set his face against my shoulder. "Papa would be proud of you, Mama." "Yes," I said. "He would say it was the best Mortis he had ever seen." "Your grandfather would say that," I told him. "Your papa would say it was close." Eli laughed, a short, genuine sound, the first one I had heard from him in weeks. Across the table, Sigrid's eyes were wet, though she did not look away. She looked at Eli with the expression of someone who has just understood something about a person they had thought they already understood. 3 weeks after the fever, on the 58th day of construction, I woke at 4 in the morning to a sound. It was not a loud sound. This is what I want to be precise about, because it would be easier to describe what happened as a dramatic failure, a catastrophe averted. But the truth is, it was a small sound, dry, like a single note on an instrument that should not be making music. I was out of the wagon and across the clearing with the lantern before I was fully awake, operating on the particular awareness that comes to people who have built something and live close enough to it to feel its changes before their conscious mind can articulate what they are feeling. Sigrid was beside me in 20 seconds. She was carrying the chisel, the good one, the one from Halvard. She had been sleeping with it under her bedroll since the week of the fever, and I had not asked about it because some habits that people develop in frightening times are best left without interrogation. I held the lantern to the collar. The problem was immediately visible to someone who knew what they were looking at, a knot in the trunk, a natural feature I had noted months ago, planned to address, set aside in the pressure of the work. The living tree had been growing through all the weeks of construction at the same steady rate it had grown for 3 centuries, utterly indifferent to my schedule. The knot had risen into the path of the collar's floating face. What had been a 2-inch gap was now approximately 1 inch. The cedar grain along the pegged edge of the collar was beginning to separate under the pressure of the trunk pressing into its clearance. If the collar split fully, one corner of the platform would drop 2 inches. With the beam structure currently in place, a 2-inch drop at that corner would put torque on the fourth and fifth beam connections that they were not designed to absorb at that angle. The floor would not collapse, but it would be damaged in a way that would take days to repair and might compromise the collar joint permanently. Sigrid did not panic. She said, "Tell me what to do," quickly and calmly. I told her, "Hold the lantern steady at this angle. Hand me tools in the order I ask for them. Do not speak while I am cutting." She said, "Eli." He was in the doorway, already dressed. He had heard or felt the way children feel the change in adult sleep and had gotten up on his own. Sigrid gave him the sequence, chisel rasp curved spokes have in that order, each one passed up the moment I asked for it. No earlier, no later. I went up the ladder with the lantern hung from my belt. What followed was 2 hours and 15 minutes of work that I cannot fully describe in ordinary terms because it required a quality of attention that flattens language. The cedar collar's inner face had to be set back along a 6-inch arc, thin shavings, not aggressive cuts, because aggressive cuts would change the collar's symmetry and create a new stress point. I worked by feel as much as by sight, taking passes that I could measure by their sound and their resistance more than by what the lantern showed me. The knot itself was the more delicate problem. My father had shown me once in his main boatyard how to identify the boundary between dead bark and living cambium by temperature. The dead tissue runs cooler under the fingertip. The living tissue holds its warmth because the sap is still moving through it. Touching the living cambium with a cutting tool was not an option. The cambium was the tree's circulatory layer. Damage it and the tree died at that point, which would create a rotting section in the very surface the collar depended on for its smooth operation. I worked with the pads of my fingers against the bark between every cut, feeling for the thermal boundary, taking only what was on the cold side of it. Eli passed the tools in perfect sequence, each one exactly when I needed it, without being told twice, without fumbling, without the anxious commentary of a child who wants to be reassured. He simply handed things up and waited. At 6:30 in the first gray light that had begun to come through the canopy, I pushed the collar through a full 3-inch cycle. It moved without catching. I pushed it back. It moved again, smooth as a fitted piston, the way my father's best work had always felt. Not loose, not tight, but right, which is a quality that cannot be fully explained because it lives in the sensation of it rather than in any measurement. I drove the shim peg. I came down the ladder. I sat in the wet November grass and my hands shook for approximately 10 minutes, which I did not try to stop. Eli sat beside me without touching me, which was exactly what I needed him to do. His presence without pressure, his company without demand. Sigrid crouched on my other side. She put her hand on the back of my neck between the shoulders, a specific pressure that our mother had used when we were sick as children, a pressure that meant, "I am here. You are not alone in this. The thing is finished now. Father would be proud of you," she said. I could not answer. "He would be proud of what you built. He would be proud of how you fixed it. He would be proud of you, Myron. I need you to hear that." I heard it. I held it in the way you hold things that are true, but almost too true to hold without it costing something. By day 45, the 8 walls were enclosed. Split cedar planking, tongue and groove, each board seated and pegged. The walls were not vertical. They curved inward slightly toward the trunk, following the shape I had drawn in the original plan so that the room had an organic narrowing at the top. That was not a flaw, but a feature directing rain load outward and providing a natural compression that strengthened the structure under wind lateral force. The wall plates were locked in place. The first rafters were pegged. By day 55, we slept inside for the first time. Not all of us. Sigrid was at the Bjornsson farm for 2 nights because Mrs. Bjornsson's hip had gone wrong, and there was no one else to help with the household and the milking, and Sigrid had simply announced she would go without being asked, which was the action of someone who had taken up full residence in a life rather than renting a temporary position in it. Just the three of us, myself, Eli, Clara. The roof was still tarped canvas. The west window was framed but not glazed. The stove was in place but had not been tested. The floor was complete. The walls were solid, the collar floated in its 2-inch gap, and the oak's living trunk rose through the center of the round room and disappeared above us into the canopy. I lay on my back on the cedar floor in the dark and listened. Clara's voice came from her bed against the east wall. "Mama, I can hear the tree breathing." I asked her what it sounded like. "Like someone very big breathing slowly," she said. "Like they are sleeping and they do not know we are here." Eli's voice from the other side of the trunk. "It sounds like Papa when he slept. He breathed like that, slow and even. I used to listen to it when I could not sleep." I closed my eyes. The tree breathed around us. Outside, the November night held the clearing in its cold. Inside, the walls held 58 degrees and the smell of fresh cedar shavings and the sound of 2 children settling towards sleep in the slow living exhalation of a thing 3 centuries older than any of us that had been holding this particular piece of Oregon ground in its roots since before the territory had a written name. I whispered to Thomas, to my father, to whoever was listening, yes, this is it. This is the thing. The storm did not announce itself. This is the thing I have told people since when they ask about that November, when they want the story to begin with a dramatic sky or a morning of warning winds that gave people time to prepare their responses. It did not work that way. The valley had been cold for 2 weeks, the kind of cold that sits in the low places and does not lift even at midday. And then on the 26th of November, the sky simply closed. Not darkened. Closed the way a hand closes, the way something that has been deciding finally decides. By noon, the light was gone. By 1 o'clock, the rain had started. By nightfall, the valley was drowning. 3 inches fell in the first 6 hours. The Calapooya tributary, which had been running low after a dry October, took the water faster than its banks could accommodate. The low bank on the Miller property went first. The Miller chicken coop went with the bank, a structure of perhaps 100 board feet, spinning away into the current without ceremony. In Sweet Home itself, the back storeroom of the mercantile, which had a shallow pitch roof that its owner had been meaning to reinforce for 3 seasons, took on water weight until the cedar shake gave way, and the ceiling came down in a single wet collapse into a winter's worth of dry goods. Inside the oak crown 12 feet above all of this, the stove held 58 degrees. I had lit it at noon when the sky closed before the rain started because I had felt the pressure drop in the way that people feel it when they have spent enough time outdoors to read weather in their bodies before their minds catch up. The 6 cedar barrels Sigrid had positioned beneath the oak's drip line over the preceding 2 weeks, a project she had undertaken without explaining it to me, working from the same instinct that had made our father pre-rig his boats before a forecast confirmed the need filled within 90 minutes of the rain beginning. The hand-cut half-pipe channels I had set into the outer eaves did exactly what I had designed them to do, directing the sheeting water into the barrels rather than letting it run free. I watched the chalk mark on the trunk above the collar. In the first hour of the wind-loaded rain, the collar moved 1/16 of an inch along the vertical grain, the trunk flexing imperceptibly under the load the crown was taking. The movement was within what I had designed for. The chalk mark told me this with the same calm precision it would have used to tell me something was wrong, which is what good measurements do. They give you the same face regardless of whether the news is good or bad, and you have to learn to read the face rather than project onto it what you hope to see. Clara was asleep with her cheek on the corn husk doll that Tilly had made for her during the fever week when Clara had been too hot for anything but the lightest cotton and had needed something to hold. Eli was reading by lantern on the far side of the trunk, working through a borrowed primer with the focused unhurriedness of a boy who has learned to treat knowledge the way he treats every other kind of work, one careful piece at a time. Sigrid stood at the south window with both hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the rain come down through the oak canopy and curtains. Tilly had arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She had come up the ladder without announcement, which was consistent with every other way she had ever arrived anywhere. Her cabin sat in the low ground beside the creek, and the creek had begun making its intentions known around midday. Not flooding yet, but communicating. Tilly had looked at her cabin floor, then at the rising water line on the near bank. Then she had gathered what she chose to gather, which was not much: a basket, a blanket, a small carved wooden box that she did not explain, and she had walked the half-mile to the oak. She climbed the ladder with a steadiness that people 30 years younger would not have managed without using both hands. She sat down in the rocking chair I had built her in the third week of October, after she had spent 2 afternoons sitting on the floor with her back against the trunk, and I had watched her stand up afterward with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints have logged 7 decades of Oregon winters. She did not ask whether she could stay. She arranged her blanket across her lap, set the carved box on the floor beside the chair, and closed her eyes for a moment in the particular way of someone who has arrived. Somewhere they intended to arrive. She was home. The word applied. The oak had been hers longer than it had been mine, longer than it had been anyone's who was still living, and if she chose to sit in it during a storm, rather than in the low cabin that was currently filling with creek water, that was not a question I had standing to ask about. The second day of the storm brought the kind of rain that stops being weather and becomes geography. It was not falling through the landscape so much as becoming part of it, the boundary between air and ground dissolving, until the whole valley existed in a continuous gray medium that had forgotten the distinction. I tracked the collar every 2 hours. I inspected each of the 8 beam connections, running my hands along the peg seats in the dark, the way you check a knot in bad conditions. Not because you expect it to have failed, but because the checking itself is a form of attention that keeps you honest. None of them had moved. The floor was joint, the walls were holding. On the evening of the second day, at a point in the night, when the rain had settled into a rhythm that almost resembled normalcy, Doyle appeared at the base of the ladder. I heard him before I saw him, boots on the wet ground, the particular sound of someone moving through standing water without trying to avoid it anymore because there was nowhere dry left to step. I went out onto the porch with the lantern. He was standing at the foot of the ladder with his hat completely saturated, the brim collapsed under the weight of its own water, his boots so far past wet that they were simply part of the landscape he was standing in. He had worked for Ward for 11 years. He had said things in Sweet Home in the ordinary way of a man who works for someone and absorbs that person's opinions along with these wages that had added to the difficulty of my first weeks on this land. He looked up at the lantern. He said, "Mrs. Lindqvist, my cabin went under. This is the nearest roof." I said, "Come up, Mr. Doyle." He climbed with the effortful care of someone whose body has been cold long enough that the commands from the mind are arriving slower than usual. I put him in the chair nearest the stove. I put a blanket around his shoulders. Clara, who had woken when she heard the boots on the ladder rungs, appeared from her bed with the corn husk doll under one arm. She looked at Doyle for a moment, assessing. Then she crossed the room and set the doll on the floor beside his chair in the posture of someone making a considered donation. "It helps," she explained. He looked at it. He nodded, which was all he could manage. For 20 minutes, Doyle said nothing coherent. The stove worked on him. Gradually, his color changed from the gray-blue of the prolonged cold to something closer to the pink of a living person. Eli brought him a pair of wool socks from the chest at the foot of his own bed, walking across the room with the directness of someone who has identified a practical problem and its practical solution. When Doyle could finally speak in consecutive sentences, he did not look at me. He looked at the trunk, at the place where the collar floated its 2-inch gap around the living wood, and he said, "Mrs. Lindqvist, I owe you an apology. I have said things about you in Sweet Home that I would take back if I could. I said them because Ward paid me to say them. I was wrong about you, wrong about this house, wrong about that tree." A pause. I knew I was wrong by October. I just kept on saying it. I told him he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. He put his face in his hands. After a moment, Clara retrieved the corn husk doll from beside Doyle's boot, carried it across the room, and tucked it back under her arm before returning to her bed, its work done for the evening. The storm's third day was when it found Ward's house. The Ward property was 3 miles south on higher ground than mine, but not high enough for the protection Ward had apparently assumed it conferred. His roof was cedar shake over a shallow pitch frame, the pitch chosen for economy rather than drainage, a decision that worked adequately in normal winters, when the rain came in manageable amounts and had time to shed before accumulating. 3 days of continuous Pacific rain had not come in manageable amounts. By the morning of the third day, the water was finding its way through the shake at the ridge. By noon, it was a stream rather than a seep. By 2 in the afternoon, the ceiling plaster in the upper rooms had taken on enough moisture to begin releasing itself in soft, wet sections, coming down with a sound like something settling that has been waiting a long time to settle. Edmund was 10 years old. He had put himself under 2 quilts in his room, both of which were damp, and he was shivering with the particular focused misery of a child who is cold, but is also trying not to complain about being cold because he understands in some peripheral way that the adults around him are dealing with something larger than his comfort. Margaret was running between 3 rooms with buckets, the tactical problem of 3 separate leak points requiring the kind of rapid repositioning that leaves no time to think about anything except the immediate next container to be moved. Ward came up from the parlor. His boots were wet. His face had the quality it got when something in his world was not conforming to his expectations of it. Not rage yet, but the pressurized precursor to it, the look of a man who has decided that something or someone is at fault before he has identified what or who. He looked at Margaret with her bucket and her wet hair and the plaster coming down behind her, and he said, "This is your doing." She did not stop moving the bucket. She said, "Cornelius, the roof. You brought this on this house." His voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been building towards something for a long time. "You and your barren womb and the God that will not give me a second son." She had heard versions of this for 20 years. The specific phrasing varied. The verdict never did. She had developed over those 20 years a set of internal accommodations that allowed her to remain functional in the presence of it, a kind of practiced partial absence, a retreat to a smaller place inside herself where the words could not reach as far. But the partial absence required a certain baseline of physical safety to maintain a minimum distance, a room with more than one exit. He struck her. A closed fist, not an open hand, which was not always how it happened, but was how it happened when the pressurized precursor had been building longest. She went into the edge of the dining table. He struck her again. He told her to get out. She ran into the rain without a coat, without a shawl, in her house dress, and her indoor shoes with the blood from her mouth mixing with the rain on her chin. She ran through the standing water on the Ward property's front track, through the gate that stood permanently open onto the road. She knew where she was going before she had consciously decided. The tree had room. Sigrid had said it 4 weeks ago on a dry Sunday afternoon under a different sky, and the sentence had been sitting in Margaret Ward patient as a seed waiting for the moment it was needed. She ran 3 miles in the rain. I was standing at the south window when the motion came through the curtain of water falling from the canopy's outer edge. A figure moving up the track with the irregular gait of someone whose body is still going past the point where it has enough left to go. I had the lantern in my hand before I understood what I was seeing. Sigrid was beside me before I reached the door. We went down the ladder together, not in sequence, but together side by side where the ladder width allowed one after the other, where it did not fast in a way that I had not moved since the night of the collar crisis. Margaret reached the base of the trunk as we reached the ground. She did not fall so much as arrive at her knees. The knees were simply the next thing after the running, the body's announcement that the running part was finished. Her mouth was bleeding. Her left cheekbone had already begun to change color in the way that means the damage is structural rather than surface. She was soaked through every layer. Sigrid took her left side. I took her right. We got her up. What followed, two women carrying a third woman up a rope ladder in a Pacific gale, the wind pushing at the ladder's lower rungs, the rain making every rung a negotiation between grip and movement I cannot fully account for in mechanical terms. I know that Sigrid's hands were under Margaret's arms and mine were steadying the ladder against the windload on the far side, and I know that we got her to the top, and I know that Tilly had the stove door open and the warmest blanket we owned laid across the chair nearest to it before we came through the door because Tilly had been watching from the south window and had understood what was coming before we reached the base of the trunk. We got Margaret into the chair. Sigrid stripped the wet dress with the efficient practicality of someone who has helped bodies in distress before. The ship crossing had given her a particular knowledge of what cold and shock together do to a person, and she moved from that knowledge without having to think about it. Wool blankets layered, a cup of chicory heated on the stovetop held to Margaret's lips, while her hands were still too unsteady to hold it themselves. The bleeding from her mouth was not stopping on its own. Tilly produced something from the carved wooden box that she applied with the same quiet certainty she had brought to Clara's fever poultice, and the bleeding slowed. Margaret drank 3 careful sips. Then she said, "He will come for me." Sigrid looked at me across the top of Margaret's head. I looked at Tilly. Tilly said in the steady, unhurried voice she used when she was stating something she had already decided, "Let him come." Ward came at 5:30. I heard his boots on the track before Doyle did. Though Doyle had been watching the south window since Margaret arrived with the expression of a man doing a calculation, he has been running for some time. Ward was not in a rage when he arrived. This was the more dangerous configuration. Rage burns hot, moves fast, makes mistakes. What Ward had after a 3-mile walk in a storm that had been humiliating his roof for 3 days was something colder and more considered. The civilized remainder, the part that dresses itself in reasonableness, that speaks in the measured cadences of someone who has done nothing wrong and can demonstrate this if given adequate time. He stood at the base of the ladder. The rain came off his hat's ruined brim in a steady pour. He called up, "Mrs. Lindqvist, good evening. I believe my wife has come this way. She has been unwell. I would like to take her home." I did not answer. I was on the porch with the lantern, Sigrid beside me. Sigrid had the chisel. Doyle stood up from the chair by the stove. He had been in it for 2 hours, drying in increments, returning by degrees to full operational capacity. He walked to the door. He stepped out onto the porch beside us. Ward saw him from below, and the calculation on his face shifted, rerunning itself with a new variable. "Doyle." The voice dropped to the foreman register, which was more direct. "What the hell are you doing up there?" "Drying off, Mr. Ward." "Get down here, I need you." "No, sir." "Doyle." "I quit this morning," Doyle said. "In my heart, I only just now made the announcement." The silence that followed lasted long enough for the rain to reestablish itself as the loudest thing in the clearing. Ward's face ran through several internal adjustments, none of which produced the expression he wanted. Then he looked up past Doyle to where I was standing with the lantern. "Mrs. Lindqvist." The reasonableness returned, a coat put back on. "I understand there has been some kind of misunderstanding this afternoon. My wife is not well. She is not in her right mind. I would like to bring her home where she can rest." "Mrs. Ward is sleeping," I said. "She is injured. She will stay here tonight." "Mrs. Lindqvist, I think if you understood the full situation, if you come up this ladder, Mr. Ward, 3 things will happen." He waited, which was itself a tell. A man who believed he had the stronger position would not wait. He would speak. First, I said, my sister will break your hand with a chisel. She is faster than you, and she has more reason than you. Do not weigh this against her size. Second, Mr. Doyle will testify before whatever court is appropriate that he has direct knowledge of your treatment of your wife, which he does. Third, tomorrow morning I ride to Albany. Dr. Fenn has seen Margaret's face. Sheriff Danvers will hear what Dr. Fenn saw and what I saw and what 4 other people in this tree can confirm. Your wife's mouth is bleeding. Her cheekbone is injured. A child of 5 can see it clearly enough to be frightened by it. A jury will see it the same way. Ward stood in the rain. His face moved through its weathers. The anger first, which was genuine, then the calculation, which was practiced, then something that arrived unexpectedly and that I had not seen on his face before in any of our encounters. It was not quite shame. It was the proximate state, the state just before shame, when a person sees their own reflection in a surface they did not expect to be reflective. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Then he said, the boy, Edmund, he is alone in the house. The roof, he stopped again. What came next was said quietly without any of the practice registers and something closer to his actual voice, which turned out to be less assured than either of the versions he used in public. I do not know how to hold a roof in a storm like this. I have been trying all day. I do not know how. The admission sat in the rain between us. I looked at Sigrid. Her face had not changed its position on the matter of Ward. The chisel was still in her right hand, her body still between him and the ladder's top rung. But her eyes had moved briefly toward the image of a 10-year-old boy in a house with a failing roof, which was a calculation separate from the one about Ward himself. Tilly appeared in the doorway behind us. She had heard everything. Tilly always heard everything, which was one of the things about her that people who dismissed her as simply old consistently underestimated. She said the boy did not strike his mother. I said, bring Edmund, only Edmund. You will stay in the tool shed below. Doyle will stay with you. You will not come up this ladder tonight. Do you understand what I am telling you? Yes, Ward said. If you come up, you will not come down as a free man. There are 4 witnesses in this tree. Do you understand? Yes. Go get your son. He went. He came back in slightly under an hour, which meant he had moved at a pace that was not walking. The thought of Edmund alone in the leaking house had done what none of the rest of the conversation had managed to do, which was to make Ward move faster than he thought necessary. Edmund was with him wrapped in a bedroll that was mostly dry, holding a small carved wooden horse in both hands, with the grip of someone holding the one thing that is certainly not going to change tonight. The horse had been carved from a piece of close-grained pine. With considerable skill, the legs articulated the mane rendered in parallel knife strokes. Someone who loved the boy had made it for him. Sigrid went down the ladder to take the boy. She did not speak to Ward on the way down. She did not look at him. She took Edmund from his father's arms with the directness of someone performing a transfer of something valuable from one set of hands to a better set, and she brought him up. Ward watched his son ascend the ladder in the arms of a woman he did not know, into a house he had spent 2 months trying to prevent from existing, and he did not say anything. His foreman came around from the base of the tree, and the 2 of them went to the tool shed. Tilly brought them soup in 2 blankets and a single lantern, setting these items down inside the shed door without comment or eye contact, and came back up. Edmund was 10 years old, and he had the particular pallor of a child who has been cold for longer than cold is interesting. He stood in the middle of the round room and turned in a slow circle, taking in the walls, the stove, the trunk, the lamplight on the cedar ceiling, the fact that nothing was dripping. He looked at the collar floating its gap around the living wood. He looked at it for several seconds with a specific attention that reminded me of something I could not immediately place. And then I placed it. It was the attention my father used on joinery. He had not seen before the look of someone trying to understand how a thing works by looking at it long enough. Clara appeared from her bed. She looked at Edmund for a moment. Then she crossed the room and held out the corn-husk doll to him without speaking, which was unusual for Clara, who generally accompanied her gestures with full commentary. Edmund looked at the doll. He took it with a gravity that matched hers. He sat down on the floor near the stove, the wooden horse in one hand and the corn-husk doll in the other, and within 10 minutes he was asleep. The night moved into its deepest hours. Margaret lay in the bed I had given up sleeping, the heavy sleep of someone whose body has been running for too long on emergency reserves. Eli was on his cedar platform. Clara had returned to her own bed, the doll retrieved from Edmund's sleeping hand and tucked once more under her arm. Edmund was on the floor near the stove, covered with the blanket Tilly had warmed. Doyle was in the tool shed below with Ward, two men with a complex history between them, sitting in a shed in a storm, with a lantern in whatever they chose or did not choose to say to each other. Sigrid had lain down on the floor beside Margaret's bed. She had not asked anyone whether this was the right thing to do. She had simply taken a blanket from the chest, folded it into a pad on the cedar floor, and lain down with her back to the wall and her face toward the bed, and reached up to take Margaret's hand where it rested on the edge of the mattress. Margaret was asleep. Sigrid held her hand anyway. I had seen Sigrid do this once before when we were children in Maine, and I had been sick enough to frighten both of us, and she had slept on the floor beside my bed for 3 nights, holding my hand through the blanket without explaining why. Tilly began to sing at 3 in the morning. She had been sitting in her chair since Edmund fell asleep, not asleep herself, not precisely awake in the ordinary sense in the state that very old people sometimes occupy in the deep hours, a watchful rest that is its own category. When she began singing, it was without preamble, without announcement, a sound that started so quietly it was indistinguishable at first from the rain on the cedar roof, and then gradually became distinct from it, became something with intention behind it, with direction. I did not know the language. It was Kalapuya, which has almost no speakers left in these hills, which had been a living daily language for this valley before the settlements and the removals in the years of deliberate forgetting that settlements and removals tend to produce. I did not need to know the words. The structure of it was clear in the way that certain structures are cleared across every language. It was a mother song, the specific cadence of a voice that is saying to a small person, "You are here, you are held, the dark is not as large as it seems from where you are lying." Tilly told me years later that she had last sung it in 1835. Her daughter Kinta had been 4 years old. The measles had come from a family upriver, the invisible passage of something with no politics or intentions, simply moving from body to body the way all such things move. Kinta had died in 7 days. Tilly had buried her daughter under a young oak on the edge of the property and had not sung the song again for 33 years because the song belonged to Kinta, and Kinta was the only person she had been able to imagine hearing it. On that November night, she sang it for women who had lost. She sang it for Margaret, who had lost 3 children before they could be held. She sang it for Sigrid, who had lost 1 child on cold water and a husband before that. She sang it for me, though I had not lost a child. I had lost the person who would have stood beside me while I built this, who would have looked up at the collar floating in its gap and said, "Yes, exactly, that is exactly right." She sang it for herself, for Kinta, for the 33 years of not singing it, which were their own kind of loss. Eli was awake. I saw his hand in the darkness reaching across the gap between his sleeping platform and his sister's bed, finding Clara's hand in the folds of her blanket, closing around it. He did not speak. He held on. I lay in the dark, listening to Tilly's voice fill the round room, fill the space between the walls. My sister's hands had helped to build, fill the air that moved around the living trunk of a 300-year-old tree, and I thought about what it meant to be inside something, rather than inside it. The oak was not a platform for a house. The house was inside the oak the way a thought is inside the mind that thinks it. The tree was the larger structure, the one that had been here before any of us arrived with our losses and our plans, the one that would be here after. We had built inside its tolerance for us, That was not the same as ownership. It was something better. At 4:30 in the morning, Ward came to the base of the ladder. He did not climb. He stood at the bottom and called up quietly enough that only someone listening would hear it. "Mrs. Lindqvist, please." A word. I went onto the porch with the lantern. The rain had eased in the last hour to something that was technically still rain, but felt more like the memory of rain. The valley still soaked the air, still saturated, but the driving force gone out of it. Ward looked up at me. He had been in the tool shed for 7 hours in the dark, in the cold, in the company of a man who had quit working for him in his heart that morning and had subsequently made the announcement. Whatever those 7 hours had done to him, it was visible. He said, "I have been thinking since I came in from the rain." I waited. "I have a deed in my coat." He put his hand to the inner pocket. "I had planned to use it against you." The Pedersen tract 12 good acres on the east side flat ground, the kind of ground you could actually farm. I bought it 3 weeks ago from the widow Pedersen. I was going to offer it to you in exchange for yours. You would have left this tree. I would have gotten the oak. "For the lumber," I said. "For $200 of clear lumber, yes." He did not try to dress it. That was the plan. "What is the plan now, Mr. Ward?" He was quiet for a moment. Below him, somewhere in the dark of the tool shed, I could hear Doyle's breathing, awake, listening. Ward said, "I am giving you the Pedersen tract. No conditions, no exchange. You add 12 acres of workable ground to your 12 acres of rock, and you can plant or graze or do whatever can be done with it." He reached into the pocket and took out the deed. The paper was water damaged, the edges soft, but the body of it had been protected enough by the coat that the writing was legible. He set it on the lowest rung of the ladder. He stepped back. "Why?" I said. Not a challenge, I wanted to understand. He looked at the ladder for a moment before he answered. "Because I sat in that shed all night listening to my son sleep up there." He gestured upward toward the sound of Edmund's breathing through the floor planking above him. "My son slept in 10 minutes. He has not slept easy in this valley since he was born. The house leaks. I built it cheap and it leaks, and I knew it leaked, and I kept telling myself I would fix it, and I did not fix it. My boy slept in 10 minutes in a house built by a woman I have been trying to ruin for 2 months." He stopped, started again with the flatness of someone delivering a verdict on themselves. "I also cannot continue to hold the land I took from the widow Peterson and call myself a man who does right by people. I took it for $60 because she needed the money and I had it, and she did not have anyone to tell her it was worth more. That is not a transaction I should be able to sleep on." I came down the ladder. I picked up the deed. I said 4 conditions. He said yes. "First, you will tell every person in Sweet Home the truth of this house, who built it, how it was built, what it is, not a flattering version, the plain version. The tree, the design, the women who built it, the winter it was built in." Yes. "Second, you will not take a living oak in this valley for timber again. Deadfall salvage trees already down, those are yours. A living oak is not yours to take." He looked at the tree for a moment. "Yes." "Third, tomorrow you will ride to Tilly's cabin. You will knock on the door. You will stand there and you will tell her that you have spent 20 years calling her names behind her back, and that in 1862, you told a story about her that cost her the trust of people in this valley who might otherwise have helped her. And you know what story I mean. You will not ask her to forgive you. You will not ask her for anything. You will only say what you did. That is all." Ward was still for longer than he had been still at any other point in the conversation. The rain touched the ground around him. Finally, he said yes. "Fourth." I looked up at the porch where Sigrid had come to stand in the doorway without my hearing her come. She was looking down at Ward with the expression she had been wearing since Margaret arrived. "Your wife is not your property. She has not been your property. You will sign a paper tonight in front of Doyle and Tilly, and that paper will go to the Albany courthouse, and it will say that if you strike her again, she has permanent right to shelter in this house, and you will have no legal claim to compel her return. Doyle witnesses, Tilly witnesses. The paper goes to Albany in the morning. Ward did not answer immediately. He looked at the porch at Sigrid at the dark doorway behind her, where the warm lantern light was visible. He said, "She may not come back to me regardless." "That is her decision," I said. "Your signature covers what happens if she does." "Yes," he said, "I will sign." We went to the tool shed. Doyle lit the lantern. I wrote the paper myself on the back of a grain receipt I found on the tool shed shelf, the closest thing to clean paper in the structure. The language was not a lawyer's language. It was a carpenter's language, which is to say it was specific and it named the load-bearing elements plainly. Ward signed. Doyle signed as witness. Tilly had come down the ladder silently as she always moved, and she signed in the Roman letters that Clara had been teaching her on the flat rock beside the sorting, stone slow careful capitals that were more deliberate than any signature I had ever seen, each letter an intentional act. The paper went into the tin box. Ward lay down on the tool shed bench. He did not sleep. I heard him through the thin wall moving once, then settling into the stillness of someone who has stopped trying to get comfortable because comfort is not available. The storm ended on the morning of the 29th, not gradually. The Pacific storms of this valley end with a specificity that always surprises people from other climates, a clear line between storm and not storm, as though someone has moved from one room to another. The rain stopped. The clouds moved east. The sun came through the Cascade Gap at 7 in the morning with the particular slant of November light that has weight to it, that falls on things rather than simply illuminating them, and everything it touched: the standing water in the clearing, the wet cedar walls of the oak crown, the mud of the track, the oak's bark dark with saturation turned briefly into something else, something that held light rather than merely receiving it. Margaret came out onto the porch. She stood in the November sun with the blanket still around her shoulders. Her face turned toward the gap in the mountains where the light was coming through. The bruising had settled into full color overnight. The cheekbone purple-green, the jaw swollen on the left side, the corner of her mouth still tender. She stood straight, not performing straightness. Actually straight, the posture of someone who has put something down that they have been carrying for a long time, and found, to their surprise, that they can stand upright without it. Sigrid stood to her left. I stood to her right. Tilly was in the doorway behind us. Below Ward was, saddling the horse a neighbor had ridden up with at first light, having heard through whatever channel bad news travels fastest that Ward's house had problems. Edmund was already in the saddle, the wooden horse tucked inside his coat, visible only by the carved head protruding above his lapel. Edmund had spoken with his mother for an hour before breakfast. Margaret had told him what she told him, which I did not hear and did not need to hear, and he had cried with the specificity of a boy who is crying about a particular thing, rather than crying in general, and he had not let go of her for a full minute. He had chosen to go with his father. That was his choice to make. Ward looked up once before he turned the horse. His face was not asking for anything. It had the look of a man who has decided to stop expecting particular responses from the world and see what happens when he operates without that expectation. He turned the horse. Edmund rode out beside him. Margaret watched them until they were gone, then continued watching the empty track for a moment, then turned back toward the room. Sigrid said quietly, "Do you want to go back to him?" Margaret considered the question without performing consideration. "Not today," she said. "Possibly someday if he earns it. Not today." "Good," Sigrid said. "I would like to stay through the winter," Margaret said. "I can cook, I can read to the children, I can sew, carry things, hold a lantern where you need it held. I cannot build, but I can be useful in other ways." "Stay as long as you need," I told her. "The tree has room." She looked up into the canopy at the underside of the roof we had built inside it, at the trunk rising out of the floor and into the sky above us, and she said, "It does, it genuinely does." We finished the house by Christmas. The final west-facing wall section, the crown cap at the ridgeline, the door with its oak dowel hinges that Eli had shaped with a patience that still amazes me when I think about it, each one turned by hand, to the tolerance that would let them swell in wet seasons and contract in dry ones without binding. The stove was properly connected to the chimney run that vented above the crown. The west window was glazed with glass we ordered through the Bjornson account in Albany, carried up the ladder in sections, and set into the frame I had built for it in October. The chair was the last thing I built. I built it on the 23rd of December, working by lantern in the early morning hours after the children were asleep from a piece of close-grained cedar I had been setting aside since October. Cedar for the seat and back because cedar holds warmth without holding moisture. Legs and rails from the oak Bjornson had given me the same oak the dowels came from, dense enough to last. The arms were shaped with a slight outward curve so that a person could rest their elbows without their arms falling away from the body, the way you rest when you are not keeping yourself alert but allowing yourself to simply be where you are. I put it beside the west window. I did not tell anyone I had built it. On the morning of the 24th, Sigrid came in from carrying water. She still carried the morning water, which had stopped being a grief displacement and had become simply a thing she did part of the structure of her days, and she saw the chair. She stopped in the middle of the room with the pails in her hands and looked at it the way you look at something that fits a space you had not known was empty. She said, "Marin, whose chair's that?" "Yours," I told her. "Mine." The word had a careful quality, not skeptical, but examining. "Eli asked me to build it," I said, "before you arrived. He said a person who has lost somebody needs a chair by a window, so they can look out and remember." Sigrid set the pails down. She crossed the room. She stood beside the chair and put her hand on its arm, running her thumb along the curve of the cedar. Then she sat down. She put both hands on the armrests. She looked through the west window at the Cascade Gap, at the December sky above the mountains, at the particular long western light that came through there in the afternoon. She did not cry. She looked. I understood, watching her from the stove where I was warming water for the morning, what my son had built. He had not built furniture. He had built a location for grief, a specific place where the thing his aunt was carrying could be set down for a while, could have a view, could exist without needing to be managed or concealed. 7 years old, 14 months without his father, and he had understood something about loss that most people spend their whole lives working toward, that it needs a place to sit more than it needs to be fixed. Later that morning, I told him what Sigrid had said. He listened with his face arranged in the neutral reception he used when he was taking in information he did not know what to do with yet. Then he said, "Did she like the view?" I told him she had sat in it for a long time. "Good," he said. "Papa always said the view was the important part." He went back to what he had been doing, which was fitting a small shelf bracket into the east wall, the bracket that would hold the lantern at the height Tilly needed it for her hands at night. He picked up the chisel. He made the cut. He checked it with his thumb, the way I had taught him, feeling for level, before looking for it, because Halvard had taught me that the hands know before the eyes do if you give them enough practice. I stood in the round room of the house I had built inside a 300-year-old oak tree in the winter of 1868. 2 months into my 35th year, and I listened to my son work, and outside the west window, the cascade light was doing what it does in December, laying long and gold across the valley, finding the water that was still standing in the low places from the storm, and turning it briefly into something that looked like intention rather than accident. It is the summer of 1888 when I tell this story. I am 54 years old. The trunk has grown 2.5 inches since the morning I first pressed my palm against it, and the collar has moved 8 inches outward in that time smooth, each increment never catching again after that first crisis in the lantern light. The house has held 53 storms. I have kept count in the ledger. It has held them all. My granddaughter Margaret is 3 years old, and she has just asked me why our house is in a tree, and I have told her what I know how to tell her, because 4 women came to a tree and the tree said stay. She has thought about this and asked whether the tree is also her grandmother. I have laughed. I have cried a little. I have said yes. Below us on the drive, I can hear her father's voice. My son Eli, 27 years old, a builder of coastal vessels on the Columbia, who has never driven an iron nail through a critical joint in his working life, who uses oak dowels because his grandfather used them, and because the grandfather he never met taught his mother something that she taught to him before he was old enough to know he was being taught. I can hear his wife Anna behind him. I can hear their youngest, a boy of 3 named Thomas, after his grandfather calling up toward the porch, in the way small children call toward people above them with complete confidence that the call will be received. Sigrid is coming up the ladder with bread from her own oven because she bakes on Sundays and brings it here because she has been doing this for 19 years and sees no reason to stop. Margaret Ward is behind her with a pot of soup because she comes to Sunday dinner and has for 2 decades because the chair by the west window has been hers as much as Sigrid's, and the tree made room for her on a night in November when she ran 3 miles in the rain and arrived at the base of a ladder with nowhere else to go. Tilly is not here. Tilly died in 1884 in her sleep in the cabin I built for her on the east side of the Pedersen Tract. She was 89 years old. We buried her under a young oak that Clara had grown from an acorn of our oak, planting it the autumn she turned 8, with the seriousness she brought to everything Tilly had taught her. At the burial, Kalapuya family came out of the hills 3 days' walk from Grand Ronde. People I had never met, people whose connection to Tilly was older than my understanding of what connection could mean. They did not ask us to leave. They asked us to stand with them. We stood. Eli played the small pine flute his father had carved for him when he was 5, the one he had carried in his coat pocket every day since. Clara sang. Sigrid said a prayer she had written herself. Ward is buried on the far side of the Pedersen Tract facing away from the oak. It was his request made in the last year of his life to Margaret and to me that he be placed where he could not see the tree. He said he had not earned that view. Margaret honored the request. She also placed a small wooden cross on his grave with one word on it that she had carved herself, having learned the technique from Eli over a winter afternoon tried. It was the truest word she could find for what he had done in the years after the storm. Not succeeded, not redeemed, tried with the irregularity and the lost in the incompleteness that trying involves when the thing you are trying to correct took 20 years to build. Clara is coming home from San Francisco at Christmas, where she has been studying medicine with the specific intention of bringing both the doctor's knowledge and the grandmother's knowledge to women who cannot afford one and have been taught to distrust the other. She writes to me every 2 weeks. She signed her last letter, "Your daughter, the Acorn Girl." My granddaughter Margaret is looking at me from the cedar chair, where I am holding her, waiting for me to finish the thought I started. The rain that has been building behind the Cascades all afternoon has begun the first fat drops hitting the canopy above us, the sound of it filtering down through 300 years of leaves. The first barrel will be filling below. Eli's voice is closer now at the base of the ladder, Thomas's small, insistent calling coming up with it. I hold my granddaughter. I look up through the west window at the light changing on the gap, the particular shift that happens when rain begins to fall on the mountains before it reaches the valley, a softening at the edges of everything. I think about what Halvar taught me, what I taught Sigrid, what Eli absorbed before he was old enough to refuse it, what Clara is taking to San Francisco in the hands that sorted acorns on a flat rock in the autumn of 1868. A good joint does not fight the wood. It shakes hands with the wood. We were not the tree's owners. We were the tree's understanding of what it could hold. We came to it with our losses and our debts and our dead and our terror, and we built inside it according to its nature rather than our preference. And it held us the way things hold you when you have taken the trouble to understand what they are. That is the whole of it. That is everything the carpenters and the bankers and the men with clean watch chains on dusty roads never knew how to ask. A house is not what keeps the rain off your head. A house is what keeps the people you love inside it with you. The oak breathes around us. My granddaughter laughs because a fat, cold raindrop has come through the canopy and found her nose. 8 people will be in this room tonight. The tree will hold us all.